In this video, we're going to talk about Newsstand Variant Comics and the 3 things that you need to know about newsstand issues. Stay tuned.
Comically correct comics.
All right, so newsstand editions are only now just beginning to get the attention that they deserve because they truly are more rare, harder to find in high grade, and in my opinion, way more valuable. And they're surrounded in a certain amount of mystery because there's a lot of unknowns about newsstand comics. So we're going to try to clear a few things up today. And the 3 things that we're going to talk about is the history of newsstand comics, how they changed over time, and everything there is to talk about regarding value. And when it comes to value, we'll talk about which ones to look for, which ones to avoid paying too much for, and things along those lines. So jumping right in, let's talk about what newsstands are. And what newsstands are is basically they're just a different distribution model for the comic books. That's what we're talking about here. Comic book distributors changed up the way that they distributed comics to retailers over time, and that is what resulted in newsstand editions versus direct editions. It was never intended to be a variant of the comic or to enhance the collectability of the comics, but it absolutely has done both those things. So it all started in 1976. So prior to 1976, virtually all comics were newsstand editions. And what that meant was that retailers could return unsold copies of the comic to the distributor. And so in the beginning, what they would do is they would send all of the actual books back to the distributor of the unsold copies. And they quickly found out that this wasn't sustainable because of the cost of shipping, and it just cost too much to ship all those books back. So what they started doing is they allowed retailers to tear off the front cover and send back just the cover and destroy the rest of the comic. So it cut back on the shipping costs. Now, there was still a huge problem with this because there was a lot of administrative work and other tasks that went into issuing refunds and receiving the torn comics and verifying everything. So distributors like Marvel started to try to find different distribution models, and they came up with the direct edition model. And what the direct edition model was is it started in 1976, and retailers were able to order comics at a huge discount for through direct edition, but they were not returnable. And so you would just order set amount at a huge discount, and then you kept them. What you didn't sell, you kept. And this ended up being very successful for both parties. The direct edition, the comic book shops saw a better bottom line, and so did the comic book distributors, because they weren't having to deal with returns and unsold copies and whatnot. So it worked really well. Prior to 1976, there weren't a lot of comic book shops. I mean, in order to find comic books and collectibles and things along those lines, you had to go to a drugstore or a bookstore or an actual newsstand where you found newspapers and magazines. There'd be comics. But right around 1976 is when comic book shops actually started popping up. And so that's why they started the direct edition. And comic book shops were the only places that ordered direct edition. They only ordered directly from the distributor and had the direct editions. The other distribution models continued with the newsstand editions. So your bookstores and your drugstores and your convenience stores, they all still had the newsstand model where they would tear off the cover of the unsold copies and send those back. And it continued like this all the way until 2013 for Marvel and 2017 for DC. So between 1976 and 2013 for Marvel and 2017 for DC, they had newsstand and direct editions. Today, it's just direct editions. There's no longer newsstands. You cannot find a newsstand edition for modern books post 2017. there was a need to differentiate between the direct edition and the newsstand edition, because otherwise local comic book shops could order books at the discounted direct edition price, but then just tear off the covers and send them back and get refunded. So they had to differentiate the covers so that they couldn't be taken advantage of like this. And that's when they started to have different barcode areas on the front cover of the comic. So the first iteration of direct edition comics was the blank barcode box. And an example of this is Amazing Spider-Man 157. This is the first direct edition comic from Marvel. And essentially what they did is they made the barcode box blank. That was the direct edition. The newsstand edition had the regular barcode in there. And this issue in itself is so rare in direct edition that I couldn't even find any pictures. So the first issue of the Amazing Spider-Man run that I could find a picture of is ASM 174, and I'll put a picture up here. This blank barcode box wasn't received well by collectors and retailers. It just looks kind of weird to have a blank box on the cover. So they changed it up to a strike-through of the barcode. And a popular edition of this, as an example, is Amazing Spider-Man 194, which is the first appearance of Black Cat. And the direct edition is the barcode with a strike line through it diagonally. And the newsstand edition is just a regular barcode. This also wasn't received very well. So they switched the strike through to a Spidey head in the box. The first example of this in the Amazing Spider-Man run is ASM 202. That's the first example where they switched the direct edition to have Spidey head. And from there, they've done all manner of different things in the barcode box. Spidey head, Thor's hammer, different words, all kinds of different things. And it's really easy to tell the difference between a direct edition and a newsstand edition with the barcode in this era. The next major change from the barcode box is when they changed both the direct edition and the newsstand edition to both have barcodes, just different barcodes. And this is where it gets really tricky to identify the newsstand editions. So oftentimes the direct edition would have the barcode and then a thin black line at the top that says direct edition, and then the newsstand edition of that same comic would be the barcode with the thin black line that says something like Sensational Spider-Man. Here's an example of that in Amazing Spider-Man 601, the newsstand and direct editions, and how they look very similar but are slightly different. But sometimes in this same era, that they would have the direct edition have the barcode and say direct edition, and the newsstand edition of that would be just the barcode with no black bar in line. An example of that is Uncanny X-Men 474. And I'll put both of those up here so you can see. This one's a little bit easier to identify because you can clearly see at a glance without having to zoom in and read what's in the black bar box. One has a black bar box and one doesn't, so that's a little bit easier. The last major change in the appearance of newsstand versus direct editions was in the last era, and for Marvel, it would actually say newsstand edition in the barcode box, whereas the direct edition just wouldn't say it. And oftentimes in the newsstand edition, it would have a display until date, which was a date for retailers to know when to take it off the shelf. So here's an example of that in Amazing Spider-Man number 700, which is one of the last newsstand editions that Marvel issued ever. And DC's last iteration of newsstand editions was the barcode box that would say direct sales in the direct edition, and the newsstand edition would just omit the word direct sales. So this one is really hard to see at a glance. You have to zoom in. And an example of that here is Justice League 50, first mention of the three Jokers. We have the direct sales edition and the newsstand edition. So now that I've talked about how the appearance of newsstand versus direct editions have changed over time, let's look at how the distribution models shifted over time. So in the beginning, in 1976, it was almost primarily direct newsstand editions. And some people have the numbers between 95 and 99% of all comics were issued through newsstand channels. That's in 1976. Then in 2013 and 2017 for DC, 2013 for Marvel, it's the other way around. It completely shifted the other direction. So some people's numbers are as low as 1% are newsstand and 99% are direct. So over time, they just completely shifted. It started out almost entirely newsstand and it ended up almost entirely direct. And now it's all direct. So there's no more newsstands, it's just direct edition. There's no exact census on the numbers between newsstand and direct editions because this wasn't formally tracked. And so the important thing to remember is that it started out that direct editions were more rare, and it ended up that newsstand editions are more rare. And it's a sliding scale in between. Somewhere around 1986, there was equilibrium, where there was an equal number of direct editions issued versus newsstand editions. However, you still had to take into account that newsstand editions that were unsold were destroyed. So even if there was an equal number of them produced, they're still way more rare to find newsstand because unsold copies were destroyed, and there's also the condition factor. People that would buy comic books from a newsstand, like a Barnes & Noble or a 7-Eleven or something like that, chances are they're not an avid collector, and they just happened to see Amazing Spider-Man on the shelf, it caught their eye, and they bought it. So they likely bought the newsstand copy with the intention of reading it. So the condition is way more likely to be poor. And also, the staff stocking the shelves could have mishandled it. Any number of people could take it off the shelf, flip through it, and put it back. So it's just, there's an incredible amount of opportunity for the newsstand editions to become damaged, whereas the direct editions were likely bagged and boarded immediately and put on a shelf. So even if you look at and get solid numbers about the different numbers sold between newsstand and direct, you still have the condition factor. And getting on the topic of the census and numbers of direct editions, we will never have accurate numbers about how many newsstand editions exist because CGC didn't start out by recognizing them at all. Not until recently do they put newsstand edition on their label, and it's usually only if there's a difference in the price, in the cover price, and if you ask them to put it on the label or designate it as a variant. So we simply will just never have solid numbers on this. The horse has left the barn, so to speak. There's no way to go back and get these numbers. But the market and what comes to market is a really good indicator of the percentage of things that are out there. So now that we've talked about how newsstand editions originated, how they've evolved over time, let's talk about the most important aspect of newsstand editions, and that's the values. So generally speaking, newsstand editions are worth more than direct editions. Now, some people make the argument that, wait a minute, direct editions were so rare in the beginning, shouldn't they be worth more than the newsstand editions? And in theory, you would think yes, but that's not how it plays out in the market. I've never seen a direct edition copy sell for more than a newsstand edition. Just to research for this video, I went and looked at some of the early Amazing Spider-Man run to see if I can find some of the first direct edition copies, and I did find some. They're about 1 in 100 or 1 in 200 listings on eBay is the blank barcode box. I went ahead and bought them because they were actually just at the exact same price as the newsstands. One of them was even listed as direct edition, and it said this is super rare direct edition, but it was listed as the same price as newsstand. So in theory, you would think that the early edition direct editions are worth more, but in the actual market, that's not how it plays out. I could see it play out like that for a super popular book. For instance, Marvel Spotlight number 32, first appearance of Spider-Woman. I have never seen a direct edition copy of this, because this came out right around 1970, late 1970s, right when direct editions started coming out. I've never seen a direct edition in any grade. So, and that's a super popular book. So if a direct edition of Marvel Spotlight 32 were to come to market, I could see potentially that it would sell for more if it was listed as such and advertised as such. But to date, I've never seen an example of this. Leave a note down in the comments if you have seen an example of this, because I'd love to hear about it. The three most important aspects regarding value for newsstand comics are: number one, popularity of the book; number two, scarcity of the newsstand; and number three, condition. When you have all three of those things, when you have a super popular book, super scarce in newsstand, and in mint condition, you have a gold mine. What comes to mind? Ultimate Fallout 4 newsstand edition. Recently, actually not even that recently, it was months ago, a 9.8 CGC 9.8 newsstand edition of Ultimate Fallout 4, first appearance of Miles Morales, sold for $8,100, and this was at auction on eBay. And auctions on eBay, generally speaking, are like the low end of values. It hasn't come back to market since that one sold. Lower grade copies have come to market and have sold for astronomical prices, and that sale at the time was 800% higher than the regular edition first print 9.8. So there seems to be a exponential relationship between the popularity of the book and the increase in value. And what I mean by that is, of the same era, the same scarcity, let's say Amazing Spider-Man 700, you get a newsstand of that and you get a regular edition of that, and there's not that high of a premium. I mean, at most twice. So if a Amazing Spider-Man 700 direct edition sold for $100, a newsstand edition might sell for $200. But with Ultimate Fallout, it was 800%. Same scarcity, just not as popular of a book. So it seems to be exponential, that the more popular a book is, it's exponentially worth more in newsstand edition. Another example of this that comes to mind is Amazing Spider-Man 300, which, by the way, has skyrocketed recently. 9.8 sales of this book are going for like $4,000 for a direct edition, and there hasn't even been a newsstand edition in the last 90 days of a CGC 9.8 that's come to market. I don't even know what it would sell for, but it's so popular that it's going to have that exponential relationship. And what's crazy about Amazing Spider-Man 300 is there's over 23,000 copies of Amazing Spider-Man 300 on the CGC census. Over 23,000 graded copies, and it's fetching such a high premium. It is not a rare book by any means of the imagination. It's just a supply and demand thing. There's a huge supply, but there's an even huger demand. So one of the important things about values of newsstand comics is that people are still sleeping on this. It is not uncommon to find a newsstand edition listed at a direct edition price. And savvy buyers like you guys, because I know all of my subscribers and viewers are super savvy collectors, you guys know how to find these on eBay and Comic Link and Comic Connect on auctions, and see them listed as direct edition prices, and you snatch them up. And you should, because this is the time to do it. People are still sleeping on this. People still don't know that direct newsstand editions fetch a higher premium in most cases. I just got off the phone with a guy who's been pressing comics, and in the grading business, he's an overstreet price consultant, and he still doesn't know about newsstand editions. We were talking about ASM 300, and he said, oh, people care about newsstand editions for that? He's been doing it for 40 years. I'm like, yeah, people do care about that, to the tune of thousands of dollars. So the point is this is a good time to get in on newsstand editions. It's also important to remember that this is dynamic, and since it's so unknown, relatively speaking, there's a lot of unknown about how it's going to unfold over the collectability, but it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that newsstand editions are more rare, and it's going to add to the desirability and the collectability. As time has gone on, newsstand editions has just become more and more popular because they're rightfully so. It should be valued higher. They are way more rare. It is way harder to keep in high grade. So over time, it's going to continue to rise in value, and you should get in on it while you can, as long as you don't get crazy. Don't get that FOMO, that fear of missing out, and spend thousands of dollars for a newsstand issue. You know, unless it's really worth it. It depends on the situation. Just don't go crazy. What I would recommend, or how to capitalize on this now, is to just look for those issues that are newsstand that are listed as direct edition. That does it for this video, guys. Please leave a note in the comments. Did I miss anything? Was there any huge part about newsstand issues that I didn't cover here? Please leave a note in the comments. I'd love to hear from you guys. Follow me over on Instagram. I do that weekly giveaway, and every comment that you leave gets you an extra entry. Just make sure to put your Instagram name down below in the comments, and make sure to leave a like on your way out. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll catch you in the next video. Bye.
Comically correct comic.